Hi, everybody, and welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Rupert Brown, and I am one of the co-founders of T-. And I'm extremely, very pleased to welcome our very special guest for tonight's T- webinar, and that is Glenn Schweitzer of Rewiring Tinnitus. Glenn is a tinnitus coach, a blogger, and the author of Rewiring Tinnitus and Meniere. He is passionate about helping others who suffer from tinnitus and vestibular disorders, and volunteers as an ambassador board member for the Vestibular Disorders Association, VEDA. And our subject for tonight's webinar is about rewiring tinnitus and about Glenn's journey and his personal journey. So please welcome Glenn. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Rupert. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege.
Thanks ever so much for your time. So just to start with, could you allow the audience and the community to tell us a little bit about yourself and how your journey started?
Sure. Yeah. So my journey with hearing problems and my ears began back in 2011, roughly. I had taken time off school and I had gone back to finish up college where I live here in South Florida. And I started there was a period of about 6 months where I was starting to get these very strange symptoms that I didn't really want to confront or deal with. Like I was very much in denial, but my tinnitus, which I've had tinnitus for as long as I can remember. I can't say I was born with it for sure, but I definitely had it as a child. It never bothered me. It was just, I thought silence had a sound. I didn't know better. I thought everyone could hear a sound in silence. But over the years with concerts and parties and things like that, it would get very loud for a few hours, like the classic temporary tinnitus, and then it would go back down to its normal, very quiet volume. So it never bothered me and I was never worried about it. But fast forward to 2011, my tinnitus volume had started going up. I was starting to get like a lot of these like strange cognitive symptoms. I was getting very fatigued, very brain fogged a lot of the time, which is like a very common secondary symptom of Meniere's disease and vestibular disorders. And then I was starting to get dizzy. And then I would get these attacks where the room would spin and I would get horribly nauseous. I would get sick everywhere. And it was like a nightmare, but I didn't know what was happening. It would always happen generally in those early days following like a really salty meal. Like we'd go out to a steakhouse and I'd have some, ridiculously high sodium meal and it would trigger my symptoms and I would get sick, but I would just think it was food poisoning because it was happening always after these meals. And so there was this up and down, but like progressive worsening of my symptoms for 6 months. And it all came to a head when one night I just had this massive vertigo attack after eating fast food one night after school and with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, Megan. And my tinnitus just went to a level that I'd never heard before, just piercing sirens. I stood up to throw my food away, like the food wrappers, and the room just lurched and started spinning and I fell back to the couch. I mean, I'm lucky I was standing over a couch when it happened and not a staircase. And I just was like incapacitated for about 45 minutes by this horrible vertigo attack. And so finally I, broke down. All right, something's wrong with me. I need to go to the doctor. And that basically started my journey. And I had, like many people with both Meniere's and tinnitus, a terrible experience with my first ENT, who just filled me with dread and hopelessness and despair and just kind of told me I was going to slowly lose my hearing. I had to make all these changes, yelled at me when I asked questions, like I was scared and I just wanted to understand. And he was like, what, are you the expert now? Are you the doctor? Something like this. And I just left that day like broken, completely broken. And it took a little bit of time, but eventually I ended up finding another doctor, a subspecialty of ENT medicine called neurotology. So a neurotologist is basically like an ENT that is subspecialized in treating neurological disorders of the inner ear, hearing imbalance. And I saw this person at the University of Miami, and it was a profoundly different experience. He was hopeful and positive. He told me stories of other patients with Meniere's who were living like great lives and doing well. He told me like, some of the lifestyle changes I had made were good. And like, he told me about all these different treatments we could try and medications and surgeries if that didn't work. And he just painted a picture of a world where I could be okay. And I didn't even know it was possible until I met that man, and it changed everything. And I started, hope was the missing piece. And that this is going to be a thing that plays into my journey starting Rewiring Tinnitus later on. But I slowly got better. And for years, I just got back to living my life. I had a completely unrelated career at the time. I had a small company where we sold different supplements. I just, like most people who overcome difficult chronic illnesses, like, my tinnitus had been better. Now I know I had habituated, although I didn't know that word at the time. And my symptoms were fully managed. And I just went back to living life like most people. I didn't spend time sharing that news or talking about it on the internet or anything like that. And, it's funny because when I thought to write my book, or to write a book, it wasn't like I should write about Meniere's. It was like, I want to write a book. Like I've been a writer. I've always liked to write. And I just thought I want a writing project. And it didn't even occur to me of like, hey, you can write about that thing at first. Like it was like days of brainstorming of like, what do I know about that I could write about? And it hit me like, I really struggled with the tinnitus and the Meniere's for a while there. I bet a lot of people are struggling with that and would want to know my story. And I just, for whatever reason, I just decided that I could do it. And I started writing each day, and slowly the Meniere's book came together. But the tinnitus techniques that I've developed they were about like 2 or 3 pages in that first book. I had this one breakthrough with tinnitus where I had discovered these meditation techniques that really helped me. And then the rest of the book was just other coping tools for Meniere's. But I got so much email from this one little tiny part of the book where everyone just was like, oh my God, it finally was the thing that made the difference for me. And just for years, just so many emails that when I decided to write another book, I realized, okay, the universe is giving me a sign here. Like tinnitus is a far bigger problem than Meniere's disease. Meniere's is just one of many causes of tinnitus. And I decided to go back and kind of analyze what happened to me and do a lot of research and figure out a program to the meditation techniques that I had figured out. I had meditated for years and years. Like I was a very experienced meditator when I had stumbled into them. And I had a feeling that it would be very difficult for people to wrap their heads around it if they had never meditated before. So I kind of had to go back to the drawing board and come up with some ideas of how to help people to learn these techniques. But I wrote the second book, Rewiring Tinnitus. And as an afterthought, I was like, maybe someone would want to work with me one-on-one. Let me leave the door open to a kind of coaching or health coaching business. And I put like a little footnote in the book, like, if you're interested in working with me, go to this website. I put up a little landing page, and like a few weeks after the book was published, I got the first email from that forum, and it like took me by surprise. Like I was not ready for it. I had nothing planned. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't have like anything figured out, but I just sort of rolled with it. And here we are now, I think 6 or 7 or 8 years later, and I've now worked with hundreds and hundreds of people all over the world, and it all just grew slowly and organically. And now I've somehow built a career out of helping people, and I never in a million years saw this coming, but I'm grateful. It's very fulfilling.
It's incredible, Glenn. Your story is incredible, and it mirrors very much my own story and the problems of exactly in the problems that I had going into the ENT. And the world of ENT, from my experience now in England, is so much better than what it was 30 years ago. And it was the same. I didn't have the guy having a go at me, but I know that I heard him on the phone saying, I'll just get rid of this one and then we'll get down on the golf course. And then, a bit like yourself, him telling me that really music was kind of something that maybe I should just think of as a bit of fun, because there's no way you're going to be able to play music again. And it was like, wow. And you're absolutely right. It's a shock enough to have the problem of having tinnitus and hyperacusis, let alone them being told that you should give up the thing that you love and you're passionate about and you spent most of your young adult life doing. So I've got a million questions, and you've just suddenly, I've got so many questions, but I'd like to start with just something. So I'm going to go off.
Sure.
And I was thinking about what you were saying, and so the question will be definitely pertaining to just something you said, and it could be really interesting. And I personally would be interested to know what you feel. So you were talking about meditations, and yes. So a lot of us in the tinnitus community are aware of the existence of these fantastic mindfulness-based practices. So would you find that some people do better on things like an acceptance and commitment therapy course or a cognitive behavioral therapy course? Because I know that some of them are different. So for example, ACT is more abstract and more visual. Or would you be one of those people that would kind of administer the idea of putting it together? Would you make that a whole rather than I'm just going to do CBT? Because
no, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. So my gut answer here is that it doesn't need to be an either or thing. I don't know that you would want to commit to CBT and ACT. Like that might be at odds with one another to some extent, right? That or like a diversification of attention that's not productive. But there's no you can add meditation to any program. Right now, my program like kind of centers around meditation, but I am always actively encouraging my clients to seek out CBT, to seek out CBT apps like Auto. Sometimes like having the right team and it doesn't, taking a multidisciplinary approach is always going to give you the best results in my opinion. And I should back up a minute, like to be clear. So the mindfulness question. So mindfulness is a really interesting kind of school of meditation that has had great effects to help people habituate. I know there's other courses that deal with this, like the course that Dr. Jennifer Gans has put out, which is based on the kind of John Kabat-Zinn mindfulness-based stress reduction applied towards tinnitus, which I think is fantastic. I came at this at a bit of a different angle. The type of meditation that that I teach is not mindfulness. This is just my own personal opinion, but mindfulness, I think, is not necessarily the most direct path. I think that a simpler form of meditation actually is more useful here. So maybe it'd be helpful if I just sort of explain like the basic idea of like the meditation that I teach. So the category of meditation or the type of meditation is known as object-oriented meditation or concentration type meditation. Now, traditionally, if you learn to meditate in this way, you would be instructed to focus on the breath or a mantra or a part of the body. And it's not about just keeping a perfect, laser focused mind where you think no thoughts. Your mind is going to wander constantly, even if you're an experienced meditator. It's about getting better at noticing when you've become distracted from whatever you're concentrating on, bringing the attention back and beginning again. Like that, catching the distraction and beginning again is like one repetition of the mental exercise in some sense. And when you get good at this very simple kind of meditation, you often get into states of calm and relaxation while you're practicing for a very simple reason, right? If you're able to just concentrate on something sort of abstract and boring to some extent, like the breath or a mantra, then you're not thinking about, that argument you had with your loved one or the thing your boss said to you at work or that upcoming doctor's appointment that you're worried about. You're not thinking about any of those things. You're just focused on that one object, that one point of concentration, and the nervous system can relax. So that's the starting point. But where my work and my ideas take a sharp left turn is that I kind of summarize it for people like this. Because meditation is so calming and relaxing when you practice it often and get very good at it, and because anything can be used as the thing you're concentrating on with this very simple kind of meditation, by choosing instead to focus on the sound of the tinnitus during meditation as the object of meditation instead of a mantra or the part of the body or the breath, because there's something magic or special about the breath or mantra. But so by choosing to focus on the sound of the tinnitus, but still achieving the meditative state as a result of this meditation, right? Because you're still meditating after all, and you can still get into this state of calm and relaxation. It gives the nervous system and the brain this whole new experience to associate with the tinnitus, like a positive experience. And until you try something like this and have this experience, you really can only have two experiences of tinnitus. Like there's the experience of being distracted, where you're essentially not hearing it or thinking about it at all. And then there's the experience of hearing it and being bothered in some way. I mean, at best, if you habituate naturally, you can maybe achieve a neutral, like no emotion when you notice it, right? But you're never going to experience a positive emotional state of calm or relaxation in relation to the tinnitus. Now, it's a difficult sounding thing that I just said, like for the people that are listening, like to think about focusing on the tinnitus and expecting like, what's he saying? Like focus on the sound and you can relax. Like, I know how crazy it sounds, but there's a lot of ways that you can make this easier and tools you can use to make it easier. So like, for example, like in my book, I kind of describe it as the basic technique is just sort of doing this for a short amount of time in a relatively quiet room. But as I've worked with a lot of people, I realize like you really want to make this as easy as possible for people. So like incorporating masking, so you're not focusing on it at full volume when you try to meditate. That's very useful. Doing other things to relax ahead of time, so you're not trying to cut through a panicky state and you're starting from a more relaxed baseline. That's something that can be useful. I have audio tools that take advantage of this technology called brainwave entrainment that it can be this very mind-altering, relaxing audio technology that I incorporate into my audio program where I have guided meditation. So there's all kinds of ways to make this what sounds like a very scary thing much easier. And it doesn't create this like every day is magically better than the day before type of progression. Like habituation is never linear. The graph is always this crazy zigzagged line where it's, a lot of 3 steps forward and two steps back. But there's something very powerful about this positive reinforcement mechanism when we're dealing with neuroplasticity. Like, we're not just trying, like, all habituation programs and protocols are trying to like decrease all of the negative conditioning around the tinnitus, like the anxiety patterns, the fear patterns, the negative thought patterns, the behavioral patterns, right? And this meditation does that too, but there's something about creating this positive experience with the tinnitus, this positive association that seems to help things to speed along. Like that's my best guess, is that there's just something very powerful when you're dealing with neuroplasticity about this positive reinforcement mechanism. And so on average, like, I'm working with people maybe like 3.5 months is like my average. I'd say probably like 90 to 95% of people I work with are completely done in 3 to 3.5 months. So I have found that there is something special here. And I've seen it work for all different kinds of tinnitus and walks of life. Certainly every situation is different. It's, there are types of tinnitus, in my opinion, that are much more difficult to habituate to and can take longer, though I still believe it's possible. But as far as like other programs, like my thought process is anything that helps a person to better cope, to be more relaxed, to have a better life experience, to raise quality of life, is only going to make meditation go better. So it's never an either or thing, in my opinion. It's always a both. There's no reason not to give yourself every opportunity to heal.
That's a great answer. That's fantastic, Glenn. It's really interesting what you're saying. I'd like to take something and
Sure.
It was quite mind-blowing what you were saying, and it was very interesting. And again, it very much mirrors the kind of the thinking that I do myself with my own tinnitus, which is, again, it sounds perverse, but I sometimes create more tinnitus deliberately so that I can suddenly design that new tinnitus sound again and change it again. And it's a kind of a perverse thing, is to gain confidence with your tinnitus. So I don't deliberately try and damage my ears, not at all, but I'll take earplugs out, I'll play my instrument, I will probably encourage a little bit more tinnitus, and then exactly like you're saying, I will meditate on it, but I won't mask it. I'll just have the tinnitus in the sky. It will be in the room with me, and I'll develop that relationship a bit further, because I think exactly what you're saying. You say positivity, and I agree with that. I use the word, it's the same, but I use the idea of being confident with my tinnitus and allowing it to play and to go to play with it and observe it in a way where I'm not perceiving it as being in any way something that is hurting me or I'm fearful of it. So you're absolutely right. I think that's incredible. I mean, that's going to really resonate with our community, what you're saying.
Sure. So I want to respond to what you said. So the word confidence is actually very interesting, and I think it's actually very important. Like something I've realized a few years ago, that building a person's confidence and resiliency, and I think those two are almost synonyms, is incredibly important in the habituation process. It's interesting what you're talking. What you're describing sounds like you provoke a spike to practice coping and to design better tools, which is not something I would ever recommend. However, and here's why. A person going through this process is going to have spikes regardless, right? You don't necessarily need to go at, for people that are suffering still, you're going to have difficult experiences as you work to habituate, right? It's going to happen regardless of who you are, how you're trying to achieve it, what program you're using, what tools you're using. But one thing I talk about a lot is that this confidence thing, if there was a way to teach someone to habituate in a more linear fashion, where every day was a little bit better than the day before, and I had the choice to teach it that way or this crazy way that it just is the way it is, I would choose to teach it this way, for a reason not too far off from what you're saying, which is that every time somebody goes through a spike where they think oh my God, how am I going to live like this? This is the worst it's ever been. This is a nightmare, right? But only to come out the other side where the spike calms back down, and they calm down and they were able to relax again and realize oh no, okay, I didn't actually go backwards like I thought it was just a temporary spike. Every time you go through that, you're more resilient to the next spike. You'll remember that. You'll be more quick to use your tools. It's something you can get better at. And having confidence in your tools and confidence in your ability to cope is actually an important sort of long-term strategy. So one thing that evolved after I wrote my book that I didn't even realize was something necessary when I wrote the book was this idea that people can relapse out of habituation. And you see this a lot with people who have habituated naturally, a person who because just given it time. And as you know, like most people will habituate naturally, given a long enough period of time. The vast majority of people doing nothing will eventually raise quality of life. They'll find ways to cope. You can't, in my opinion, get to the levels of relief that are possible by working on it, that you can on average get to by doing nothing. But most people will get a lot of quality of life back, just giving it time, regardless of what they're doing. The problem is if that person suddenly experiences a spike or something changes, and look, life happens. Like, you never know if you're going to get blasted with a sound, or you get injured, or so a traumatic thing happens that causes a change in the ears. Like, this is possible for that person who habituated naturally. Not only will they not know like what to do to feel better in that moment, they won't know how they got better in the first place. Like, they may think I accepted it and now I feel better, but in that context, acceptance is more of like the emotional feeling of it not bothering you anymore, right? Because they won't be able to accept it in that moment, and the whole vicious cycle can start all over again. And that's something I see all the time, like people who had habituated naturally and then they fall out and they're struggling, and then they reach out to me for help, and that's like sort of a starting place. So like this idea of confidence ties, like I've been working for a few years to develop like long-term tools, so like helping people to better understand like what to do in that moment, like how to manage that moment, how to minimize discomfort, and a big part, and remain habituated when that difficult moment is past, because spikes always pass eventually. But like confidence is a huge piece of that, right? Like having the confidence in your tools and confidence in your ability to cope is like 75% of the battle long term. The other 25% is just going back to the tools and using them in a disciplined way until the spike passes. But just remembering your tools and having that confidence in your ability to cope, knowing like that when that anxiety thought of like, oh my God, what if it stays like this, is just that, most likely an anxiety thought, that like that puts you more than ahead of more than 50% ahead of the battle. So I really like this idea of confidence. I think the way you're doing it is a bit extreme for the average tinnitus sufferer to experiment with, like that isn't as well habituated as you and I. But it is a very interesting idea, and it's something that I think about quite a lot. So I'm glad you raised the confidence question, because this is something that comes up quite a lot in my work.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting, again, what you're saying, and I'd like to just kind of double back a little bit.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
So for me, and I'm going to go back a couple of answers. So
okay,
you were saying something earlier, which again resonated massively with me. So the first time I had it was completely catastrophic, dreadful. I really felt my musical life and my kind of conscious life was sort of gone. You know, it had faded very quickly, and I'd lost perception. I couldn't get back on track, and it was naivety that allowed me to habituate, because I was very young. I was 22, so I didn't know anything about it. So my naivety brought me to the point of habituation through very, very basic sound therapy that I just made myself using those 1980s boogie boxes, you know, when you turned up pause, volume, tone. I had about 2 of them. Eventually I had 3. So I didn't realize I was creating white noise, probably pink noise, and maybe brown or blue noise. So whatever that might have been, it really helped. And there wasn't any books about it. So I worked out that if I made those hissy sounds lower than my tinnitus, and if I did it at nighttime, because the daytime I was trying to do music, I found that my brain could relax into it, and it started to not fight the tinnitus, but it started to work with those external sounds, and it brought the sounds
100%.
down. Now, the second time it happened was in 2008. The first time was in 1990, 91. 2008 was worse in many ways because I wasn't naive and I thought I'd cracked it. And it was that kind of thing that I think a lot of us have in the community with people like us that have tinnitus, which is you always live with that tinnitus monster on your back. Even though you think you've got away from it, you kind of have in your darkest place, you know that one day if something happens to you or something untoward happens, or as a shock or another noise, that in some ways you're doomed, because you would not have that naivety. You'd have to go into it as a person fully aware of the consequences. And so what I found was really important for me, Glenn, was this time there was sound therapy involved. It was quite archaic still, because I hadn't really thought about it at that point. I just used it. So what I did was I created exactly the same sound of my tinnitus. And again, I dipped it. And it was like almost creating an oral skin graft, but it wasn't quite enough. The next thing that helped me this time, which was different, was the sound therapy, but it wasn't the main part, which was the clinical information this time, Glenn. It was the information that gave me the confidence, because this time the hyperacusis was dreadful. The tinnitus was off the scale. It was, I'd walk into a room, what's your tinnitus like? I mean, I hate that kind of notion. What's it like? 10, you know, and okay, because I don't like that. Calibrating it is a bad state of affairs. It's not a good situation. It's very negative. Anyway, it would be 15 always. So it would be a nightmare, dread going into people's houses, walking into these empty, loud spaces. But the clinical information was the thing that time that got me back. So it was understanding truly what was happening from a person that I trusted. And I really felt something from that person. So it really resonated. I knew that it was the truth. I knew that I was going to be okay. I was reassured. I felt positive about the outcome. And I then was told, don't worry about habituation. Don't worry about the process. Just don't worry about the time it takes. Just concentrate on this fixed path, which was this kind of path of learning and more learning and learning about the condition. And I found, Glenn, again, going back to some of the things you were saying, those were the things on the second time that really, really helped. It was the understanding this time. Yeah.
Sure. So, you know, what you're getting at here, which I think is like abstracted in most people's minds, but like I've been thinking a lot about, is this idea that it feels like anxiety is like the center of this, you know, the problem. And I've been talking about this in other talks and stuff recently, but or fear, you know, like it feels like that's what it feels like. And I used to think that it was sort of, you know, like the whole idea of fight or flight, it's this sort of stress response, right? It feels like that's the center of the bullseye. But what I currently believe is that it's not anxiety or fear, but a feeling of powerlessness, right? It's this feeling like there's nothing you can do to find any kind of relief. You're trapped in this horrible situation that's destroying your quality of life, right? And it's that feeling of powerlessness, like all of that anxiety, all of the suffering, like flows from this like central emotion, in my opinion. And then, you know, you go to the doctor, and like this tying back into what we were talking about before, like I've talked to hundreds of people. I've never found a single person who doesn't have a story of at least one doctor that said something terrible or told them there was nothing they can do, or, you know, they just have to live with it, which is crazy because it's not true. And it's the worst thing they could say, the very worst thing they can say, because it amplifies that feeling of powerlessness. Like people give up, and I understand it. Like how many doctors have to tell you there's nothing you can do before you decide there's nothing you can do and you're utterly hopeless. But if you get somebody who can explain things in a way where you're like, oh, I understand what's happening, and the situation is not hopeless. Like the opposite of powerlessness is empowerment, right? And just knowing there's a path forward, like having hope changes everything. That's what I went through with that first doctor. Like I didn't even know, I thought I was when I left my first ENT appointment for the Meniere's diagnosis, where he didn't do any testing. He just convinced me I had Meniere's, and that, I thought I was going to be disabled for the rest of my life. I thought I was going to slowly go deaf. Like the one person that in my life that I knew that had Meniere's disease had it in one ear. I had it in both. She had it in one, and it burned out her hearing in that ear. She was completely deaf in that ear. So that was like my one frame of reference. So I was just thinking, all right, well, I'm going to slowly go deaf. Like I'm going to be disabled. I'll never be happy. Like I just sank into the deepest, darkest depression. I mean, if you think the online landscape for tinnitus is bad, it's so much scarier for Meniere's, and it's terrifying for tinnitus, no doubt. But so like, I'm just, you know, just reinforcing of that feeling of powerlessness. And it wasn't until that doctor like painted this picture of a world that wasn't like that, like where I might be okay, that the light switch went on, and I felt empowered. And I like, from that moment forward, I did everything I could. And so like, one thing I've really worked on for years is like, I've gotten very good at is like communicating that there's hope. Like that is the most important piece of the puzzle. Like understanding that it feels like you're powerless. The doctor might have mistakenly told you that. And it's so crazy they say that, because like tinnitus retraining therapy, that's been around for 30 years. Why doesn't every ENT know that? Like that's let alone anything else that's happened in the last 3 decades, right? And like patients, and it's not just Western medicine either, it's like Eastern too, like all over the world, patients are falling through the cracks. But you're never actually powerless. Like it feels like you are. or like it seems like everyone else is when you look at the message boards, because they all went through the same experience, right? It's just, you always have power, and it's just a matter of like learning what the problem is, where the power lies, and how to exert that power. And really, another idea that came up in my mind when you were explaining before was this idea that like one thing I've really tried to do a lot of lately, and this is like a new development in my work, is like trying to recalibrate a person's mind into seeing this not as like some sort of physical hearing problem, but of an emotional and a psychological problem that looks more like post-traumatic stress disorder than anything else. Like
Wow.
of all the other conditions out there, like tinnitus and PTSD are like, the overlap is incredible. I mean, so I'll give you an example. Like someone going through, so like with a tinnitus spike, like I can be working with someone, it's up and down, but like objectively they're doing significantly better than when we first met. Their quality of life is much greater, though they're still struggling with certain things. And then all of a sudden they'll get a bad spike, and they'll just, in their mind, like it's all gone. Like they're starting all over again. Like there never was any relief, right? And that very much looks like a person having a PTSD episode. So like let's say a person goes through a very traumatic event, right? And they're like, when you're going through trauma, you're just sort of in this survival mode, and then the trauma ends, and then you're left processing. And people really struggle with PTSD. There's a lot of feelings of powerlessness, like intense anxiety and activation of the nervous system into like chronic fight or flight. Like it's a lot of this. The problem looks very similar of how it builds and manifests, but then how it presents too. So like a person who experienced a traumatic event, who is undergoing trauma therapy of whatever form they choose, they might be making progress and having better and better days. They might have had a great week, right? Like let's say it's been a few months since the trauma occurred and they've been working hard at it and they had a great week. If something happens that triggers them, and I don't even mean like triggers them in the way where they're dissociating and reliving the trauma like actively in their mind where they feel like they're in another place, but just like rips the wound open, right? Where it feels, the emotions feel very intense and fresh, like it just happened, right? That person not only will probably not remember that they had a good week right before this moment, they probably won't remember that there's been a single good day since the trauma occurred in that moment of desperation. Like it's like a black hole that goes that way into the past and into the future. It's like you're on a ship lost at sea, and not only is there no land in sight, but suddenly there never was land and never will be again, right? Like, and that's what a tinnitus spike can feel like, just especially to someone who's making progress. Like I always say, like, no matter like, when someone's working on this, like inevitably there comes a point where they're having like some of the best days they've had in a very long time, only to have another bad day. And even if that bad day is like half as bad as any bad day they've ever had before, right? Like the kind of bad day where if you gave it to them week one of struggling with tinnitus, they would have felt 50% improved, right? Like a bad day like that, it's going to feel like the worst one ever because of the difference, right? Like no matter what, like the suffering is real. It reactivates that fear pattern, that anxiety pattern, the emotional patterns, like when you're suffering. And that idea of like, there's always that monster like waiting in the shadows, like even when your life gets better, like that's real. Like you can fall back into that anxiety pattern. It can just reactivate so quickly. And that just ties back into this whole confidence thing. Like if you have confidence in your ability to cope and confidence in your tools, even if you're feeling the anxiety, you can go back to those tools and reactivate your defenses and protect yourself. So I know it feels like the monster is always lurking, but I would argue that you can learn to protect yourself. And I've used these techniques that I teach and all sorts of techniques to do this. And so now, like if I have a tinnitus spike now, I've sort of trained my body, and I do get them periodically. Like most likely it has to do with Meniere's, like how often I get spikes. Like but everyone gets, most people with tinnitus, even after they habituate, will have moments where they notice it's louder. For me now, I can notice that my tinnitus is like 40 to 50% elevated. As long as it's my normal baseline tone, that won't necessarily activate me where I need to do something to cope. Like I might be able to bounce off of that. It's like I can get back to whatever I was doing. But when I am activated, the difference is that like immediately I've sort of trained my physiology to just relax, take some breaths, and just go right into my coping tools, right? Like, so you can learn to protect yourself, even though, it's true that the monster is always lurking. So I know that was sort of a wide ranging answer, but you made me think of all these different ideas when you were explaining what you had said.
That's magic. No, it's great, Glenn. This is wonderful. And again, I'm going to double back a little bit. You can kind of get a sense that I'm quite thorough and I'm an obsessive.
Yeah, totally. I'm happy to talk about anything you want. Yeah, go back.
Brilliant.
That's great.
So what I've been working on for the last 2 years is just something personal that I will be sharing. But the idea was this world that some people, certainly myself, inhabited, which I've coined, which I kind of think of it as pre-mindfulness, which is this massive space that is almost like this journey, not too dissimilar. My visualization would be of the yellow brick road, but rather than the wizened old hack at the end of the yellow brick road who has got no idea about what's going on and gives all these false promises, it's
Sure.
like what you're met with is Gandalf at the end. So there's this path to acceptance, and then you've taken, in a sense, some kind of radical self-responsibility, which does seem radical at the time, but
yes,
the idea would be working with all of this breath work and meditations and looking at the fear and anxiety, that again, that kind of that field of trauma, and walking and working through that, looking at denial and anger. One that's come up that I had to include, and it's one that I think is very deep, and it's not one that I think is readily available in all of our minds, because I think it's so deep, is shame and guilt. And I would guess, I'm not a psychologist, but for me, I would guess that kind of fuels, it's like the two main tributaries that fuel the fear and the anxiety, because if they're not dealt with, you know, they're very deep, definitely very deep emotions. So again, the idea would be for me with the pre-mindfulness is that yellow brick road to be accepting of what is about to happen, which would be then, let's say, for example, just to coin the phrase, you're walking into that world of mindfulness, but at that point you're ready for it. Whereas what happened before was, you know, in the very early days when I was 22, so I was suffering trauma from the accident that made my tinnitus happen. So I was put in an anxiety group in this in this small little village with wonderful people. They were incredible, but it was of no use to me, really. I mean, I actually quite got a lot from it. The people were incredible, but the idea was that you were lumped into this another world, which is definitely not what you wanted. And what I was looking for was, you know, again, with that world, the idea was that, okay, so you're suffering trauma, go and do some yoga, go and play cards, go and, you know, what? I'm not ready to take that on board. I'm not comfortable. I don't know who the hell I am. How am I going to do yoga? I'm not relaxed. You know, I don't want the music. I neither want the music or I do want the music. I don't want the talking. I do want the talking. I can't breathe because I'm too stressed. It's like, so this pre-mindfulness, this space, that's a really important space. I think it has to be addressed.
Yeah. I like that a lot. And, you know, I think that a couple things like come to mind, you know, well, and it kind of mirrors your journey, right? Where it's like acceptance, to me, the way I think about acceptance is like, it's not in the classic way that people think of acceptance.
No, like, it's not, it's coexistence and integration, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll even take it a step further. Like I like the kind of stoic philosophical view of acceptance, like accept the things you can't change and work on the things you can, right? Like it's like, I always say to people, like with acceptance, this is where I come from. First, you need to like fully educate somebody on like the nature of this problem, like why there's hope, really get them to understand that. But it's sort of like, sorry, I started talking about acceptance. This is the situation we find ourselves in. Like something happened, the tinnitus is here. There's no magic fix. Like these are like this is the situation we're in. Like something, whatever happened, it happened, and this is where we find ourselves. We can't change that, and we need to stop trying. Right? Like we can't go back in time. We can't erase the sound out of our head. But again, we're not powerless, right? So it's when I find someone who's just fighting to find that cure, like spending hours and hours and hours in, you know, forum rabbit holes and Google rabbit holes and just trying to like, they just can't get past that. Like that their anxiety is just going to continue to go up and up and up and up and up. Right. And so like, that's a losing battle in my opinion. And so as far as acceptance goes, all I ask of people is like, just accept that this is the situation we find ourselves in right now. and that you're not actually powerless like it feels like you are. Let's find where the maximum levers of power exists. And it's going to be a little different for each case. And like, funneling a person into just one school, like anxiety, let's give them some SSRIs, maybe some anxiety meds, some breathing, like that can certainly help, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. And one of the things that's made me think of is like, I talk about a lot, is this idea that this is, especially if you go back to thinking of this, like, again, like a psychological and emotional problem, but really this is a physical problem, an emotional problem, and a psychological problem. We don't think of it that way because it's just a sound and we can easily ignore other sounds, but it's all of those types of problems. And all of those types of problems get worse when we avoid them, right? And so like on some level, if all you're doing is just trying to escape it with sound, drown it out completely with sound, or just stay busy, like all day long, or just calm yourself with a breathing technique when you're feeling anxiety, like you're coping. And that's incredibly important to be able to cope. But in some sense that you're just running on a treadmill, and if you can keep the treadmill going long enough, like you'll habituate naturally. Like, so there's something to be said about coping, no doubt. But on some fundamental level, you're avoiding the problem. And problems get worse when we avoid them. And that's why I like it's not about just getting someone to just meditate all the time and focus and listen to their tinnitus all the time, but like introducing like some sort of small practice where you're incorporating the tinnitus into an experience of relaxation to kind of create a new pattern. And then the rest of the time, like teach them all kinds of new coping techniques and coping skills and, anxiety management, like that's a big part of it. Same with like, things like PTSD, but there's so many other things too. Like masking is huge. And this is something I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on as well. And I've listened to a lot of your tracks, which are great. Like masking is just, it's the most basic tool. And if you get it perfect, it can really make a huge difference for you. And most people don't have a good sense of how to do that, right? Like most people like don't look enough. People get hung up on the idea of white noise because the ENTs and audiologists that do know something about habituation and tinnitus retraining therapy tend to lean in the white noise camp, right? But that just because white noise can be therapeutic for some subset of people doesn't mean that it's the best sound for everybody. Like I particularly don't like white noise. I prefer nature sounds. And so like there's all these different pieces of the puzzle, right? And they're all important. And if you want someone to make progress quickly and maximize anyone's like chance of recovery, like you want to like take advantage of as many therapies, as many strategies and coping techniques and tools as you possibly can. Masking should be a huge part of that. Meditation can be a part of that. Anxiety management can be a part of that. Therapy like CBT or ACT can be or just, any other school of therapy can certainly be a part of that. And so I'm big on this idea of like, there isn't like a one. It always requires a multidisciplinary approach if you want the best chance of success. But it's interesting. Agree. Yeah.
I totally agree, Glenn. I feel exactly the same. And that's why, the new web app we're going to have is going to encompass all of that. So
that's great.
Because
that's wonderful.
That's right. It isn't one element. It's many elements put together. Yes. You're absolutely right. And that's the thing also, when you look at let's say you look at just sound therapy for a minute, and you're right with masking. So if that's not correct, that can be something that will just keep you in a space of homeostasis. So you'll just stay kind of in this dormant state of tinnitus. Whereas you've then got distraction, but you have to be careful how you distract. The other thing that I think is really important with sound therapy is desensitization. So the hyperacusis, what I found, the sounds I go to are quite ugly in their nature, but for me, they're very real. And they're real in the sense that that's what I would find when I'm traveling to London from the Isle of Wight. So I cross a busy road, I go across a busy main road, I then go on a boat that has vibrations and noises and steel doors shutting untowardly or in a way where I'm not expecting it. And then I'm on a train, and then I'm at Waterloo, and then I'm underneath the ground.
Like you can practice being in the world with masking.
That's actually it. And then the other thing that I really focus on is the targeted frequencies. So trying to actually mirror some of those frequencies that you have and then play with them. So for example, you might find that frequency and then you take it somewhere else. So you position it somewhere else. So then if you can cradle that properly with a world of environmental sounds that are also non-linear in a sense, so they're not something that loop, or they're something that are predictable, or something that gives you a kind of a gesture of classical or new age. They're the things that I avoid like the plague, because not that I don't like classical. I have a thing about new age, but not the real sense of it, but just the falseness of really corny new age music. But I think if you can get that right, then you can take somebody on a completely different mind environment. So going back to one of the things you were saying, I've got a question before. We've got quite a few questions here, so I'm going to fire them at you if you don't mind, Glenn. But
shoot.
I've got one here that I normally leave to the end, but it seems really pertinent to try and get this one in now, which is this. If you were building for yourself or for a member of the tinnitus community a tinnitus management toolbox, what would you put in it?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question. It would be so many different things. But if I had to narrow it down to like a few key things, and this is something I'm actively thinking about, like we were talking before this, one of the projects I'm working on is trying to take everything I know and all the work I've done and create just like an online course and an online program. So this is something I've actively been thinking about, like how to distill all these down. But there needs to be a couple things. So one, cognitive behavioral therapy tools. Like we see now that can be delivered via app. That I'm not a therapist, so that's not something I actively sell or can provide to people. However, like a lot of tools and tech, you can still learn I can still teach tools and techniques that have that flavor, or just different coping tools. But okay, so it would be meditation would be a big part of that. Masking would absolutely be a big part of that. Like there's a whole long conversation. I have a lot of thoughts on masking, but masking would absolutely be a part of that. And having a variety of options. I love a lot of what you've created. I think that having more than one option and people have the wrong ideas about masking. So like education and understanding with masking, that would be a part of it. I think I said meditation, obviously a big part of it. And then a lot of just anxiety management tools, and then cognitive behavioral tools, like a lot of the standard things. Like one thing I've sort of done is I'm tool agnostic. If I learn about some like any therapeutic tool or coping strategy or coping tool, and I think, hey, this could help someone, I learn it and I teach people. And like sometimes my clients bring things to my attention. Like just recently, I learned about this tool that people learn in trauma therapy, this technique called like the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. We don't need to go into it, but like, and I'm thinking, oh, that's a beautiful thing for someone with tinnitus. So like I'm constantly learning and open to new tools, and I think that like an ever evolving toolbox might be useful too. So that would be a part of it as well. But yeah, those would be the main components, I think.
Beautiful. That's a great answer. Thank you, Glenn. We've got some questions, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Let's go into the questions.
Okay. So any tips for getting to sleep? I find it really hard with the high-pitched noise in my ears.
Okay. Yes. The sleep question is like the sleep problem rather is a big problem, right? Like a tinnitus makes it hard to fall asleep for many people, and sleep deprivation is one of the biggest triggers of tinnitus. I mean, sleep deprivation will magnify any health problem. Really, you can take the healthiest Olympian on earth and deprive them of sleep and their health will break down. But yeah, there's a lot of very simple things you can do. So the most basic thing is just getting masking right. There's a variety of ways you can do masking when you're trying to fall asleep with very high pitched tinnitus. If you're in like frequencies above 8,000 hertz, like in your, people who have tinnitus, very high pitched, very high frequencies and tones, like it's harder to mask because like most music and natural sounds and environmental sounds are not in that spectrum of frequency. But there's a variety of ways to do masking. So in my opinion, like the best version of a sound machine is not anything you'll find in a store. Like I have not seen, there are sound machines that are just okay, but like, and white noise machines that are just okay. But really the best sound machine is a decent Bluetooth speaker connected to your phone, because then you have an infinite catalog of apps that are great, including T- that you can just use to access I always tell people, you want to find like a variety of sounds that do it for you and keep them on rotation, because if it changes or fluctuates, like one sound that normally does it for you may not be doing it for you, right? So just having a variety of different apps and sounds available, like and playing it over a Bluetooth speaker, that's one way. There are speakers designed to be kind of placed under your pillow. If you search on Amazon for like pillow speakers, you'll find those. That's not my my favorite. Bluetooth speaker is probably my top choice, but then there's also headphones that can be worn to sleep. They're these sites that if you search sleep headphones on Amazon, you'll see any number of options. And it's generally like a soft, fuzzy headband. Some are Bluetooth, some are wired, where there's like very low profile speakers, like embedded over the ear speakers embedded into the soft, fuzzy headband. So you can play masking at night. There are other headphones designed to be worn to bed. So just getting like that part down, that's helpful. Making sure you have your sleep hygiene right. There's a lot of very low level, kind of not big needle moving things that you can do to improve sleep, like having the temperature being a little cooler than you think it needs to be, making it pitch black, either with a sleep mask or by blocking all ambient light, having like a relaxation routine before bed, not staring at your phone screen right before bed. Like all these are very small needle moving things. But that's a big thing. If you're really struggling with sleep, anticipatory anxiety and insomnia, like this can be a big problem for a lot of tinnitus sufferers. There's a version of CBT called CBTI that's becoming more popular now that I've had some clients have some interesting results with and good results with, that involves like a lot of sleep restriction and building sleep drive. And there's a lot of fascinating work being done there. And then I have audio. The one thing I briefly mentioned earlier when I was talking about my meditations was like brainwave entrainment, this sort of like very mind-altering, sedating, relaxing audio. So I have, and it's not just like a thing where it's like, oh, this is a nice track that reminds me of when I was with my family by that waterfall. It's a relaxing memory. It's like, no, this is an audio track that makes you feel sedated, kind of like you took something to relax. Like that's how strong of an effect it can have. And so I have tracks that can help with that. There's a lot that can be done with sleep, but it is a challenge. Getting the masking right, though, is always the starting point. Just figure out. And the hard part is finding the sounds that work, especially if you have a strange high or a high pitched tinnitus sound. Like you may have to listen to hundreds of sounds to find like a handful of sounds that do it for you. But it's worth doing that, because when people say like, oh, I can't mask it, nothing masks it, I always counter that with like, okay, you just haven't found a masking sound yet, but like there's no way you've listened to every possible sound. And just with apps alone, you can literally have an infinite catalog of sounds to choose from. So that's what comes to mind. Great
answer. I totally agree with you. There's another one here that's dealing with masking sounds. So I'd like to go straight into this one, Glenn. So
let's do it.
The question is from a different person. How do you deal with hyperacusis and tinnitus when trying masking sounds? I find them impossible and have tried most, but can't deal with the additional noise.
Yeah. So this is a tricky problem, no doubt. It's like you're walking a tightrope in that situation. Like, so whoever submitted that comment, if you're in here watching us, like I feel for you. I know how difficult that situation is. So a couple things to say here. One is that hyperacusis and just sound sensitivity in general are a very closely related problem to tinnitus. Have a lot to do with this overactivation of the nervous system and this sensitization of the auditory system. And about 40 to 50% of tinnitus patients experience some degree of sound sensitivity. I never had hyperacusis. I have experienced sound sensitivity to varying degrees depending on my Meniere symptoms and how much they're fluctuating, but never to the extreme that I see in a lot of my clients. Now, a couple things. One thing I have found is that when I'm working with people and teaching all these different ways of calming the nervous system, the meditation-based approach, I have actually found that it happens slowly, but that most people experience an improvement in hyperacusis just working to calm the nervous system down, working to improve their tinnitus. I will answer the question about masking it in just a minute, but it's worth noting that like just working to calm the nervous system and work to habituate to tinnitus, however you choose to do that, can often lead indirectly to slow improvement of hyperacusis. It may not be enough in severe cases. So what do you do in severe cases? Well, generally, as far as I've always understood, like the strategy for masking for hyperacusis is different than the strategy for tinnitus. Like generally speaking, and you might have had a different experience, Rupert. I was listening to you explain how you approached it before, but what I've generally seen is that a lower level of masking is required. And so one tendency with people with hyperacusis is you become sound avoidant, fearful of sound, and you try to like isolate and push everything away and stay in quiet, even if that's more difficult with the tinnitus because the sounds are so uncomfortable. But the more you avoid sound, the more sensitized your auditory system is going to become, and the louder those sounds are going to be. Like wearing earplugs all the time is not necessarily a good solution. Wearing like high fidelity earplugs or musicians earplugs that just decrease the decibel level but don't block everything. There's ways to like progress that, and you can slowly release sound back into your system. But finding quieter sounds that keep the auditory system sensitized enough so that the external sounds that come in don't strike at the nervous system so hard. That's been something I've seen benefit from. I remember I worked with a person in Australia a few years back who was going to some noteworthy hyperacusis clinic there. And one thing they were doing that I learned about was they would take earbud headphones playing music like at full volume, but just draped around, they'd wear it around their neck. So it's playing music full volume, but out your neck. So all you hear is a faint trickle of sound, right? But it keeps the auditory system activated enough that it acts as like a buffer to buffer these other sounds that would light up the nervous system. And so just it's tricky to find them. But if I were to make a recommendation, I would say experiment with quieter volumes, like rather than different sounds, like bringing the volume of masking down may actually lead to more comfort there. So that's something you can experiment with. And I think I had one other. That's a good starting point. I think it is hard, but it's the same thing. You got to keep looking. Like you just keep looking. Try lots of apps. Check out T-, check out any number. Search sound therapy in the app store. Nature sounds. Like you'll find hundreds of apps. Like just download a bunch of the good ones and just keep exploring. Like don't give up. That's my advice.
That's wonderful, Glenn. That's one of the greatest answers I've ever heard. I think it's fantastic. It's fantastic. Thank you. I love that. And that's something I'm going to be going back to, and I'm going to relook at that. That's lovely. I love that.
I'm not an expert in hyperacusis. Like, no, I don't want to give people the wrong idea. I've been exposed to it enough, and I've learned coping strategies, but this is not like my wheelhouse. Like, I feel confident enough to talk about it, but yeah, I'm not a sufferer of that myself. I don't have that direct experience, and so I just throw that caveat out there. Okay, sorry.
It was a great answer. I've had hyperacusis, and what you said was smashing. It was a beautiful answer. Thank you.
All right.
This has come up twice now, and it's just come up again. So 3 times we've had this similar question. So this is one about ear fullness. So may I ask Glenn about ear fullness? This seems to be quite common with hyperacusis. Why does it happen? And is there anything we can do to alleviate the feeling of ear fullness?
Yes, great questions. Okay, so ear fullness is not one thing, right? Like a feeling of fullness or congestion in your ears can be caused by a whole wide variety of problems. Like, so allergies and like sinus issues can absolutely cause ear congestion, which can cause tinnitus spikes, or, just amplify any sort of these hearing problems we're talking about. Hyperacusis also. It could be Meniere's disease, like with the thing that causes my tinnitus, where there's like this increase in pressure in the inner ear, like that could cause that feeling of fullness. Even things like TMJ can cause ear fullness. In fact, TMJ is an interesting one. Like, so that a lot of people have this somatic tinnitus where, like clenching the jaw or the neck or the muscles around the cervical spine can cause a temporary changes in tinnitus, and learning to relax the muscles can help improve. And regardless of that, like usually you see more of this sort of thing with TMJ, but TMJ is not just like you get lockjaw and you're grinding and clicking and popping your jaw. Like it can just be a misalignment of the bite. And there's all these nerves around the jaw that project to this part of the brain, the dorsal cochlear nucleus, which is one of the many regions of the brain involved in the perception of tinnitus. It's the target of like a lot of these bimodal stimulation devices that are coming on the market now, trying to like calm the neurons and nerves in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. But when you're dealing with TMJ, it could just be a misalignment of the bite, where like when your teeth are together, you want the muscles in your face to be at rest. Like, so, but if your jaw is like torquing this way or forward or backwards, like that can cause a lot of stress around the joint here. Like it's like a ball and socket joint that connects the lower jaw to the upper skull. And that not only can become referred ear pain, it can cause severe tinnitus. It can also cause ear fullness, dizziness, and vertigo. Like there's a lot of people where they were diagnosed with Meniere's, but in fact, it was a misdiagnosis and they really had somewhat severe TMJ. And then the process of treating the TMJ can alleviate a lot of the tinnitus and Meniere symptoms. Meniere's like symptoms, I should say, but that's a whole nother conversation. Finding the doctor who knows not just about TMJ and how to treat that, but is aware of these other connections. Like, it's hard enough to find a doctor who's aware of tinnitus and Meniere's disease to begin with. So that's hard to find, and it's expensive. Here in the States, it's not covered by insurance for some reason. So it's like $5,000-10,000, like easily $15,000 for treatment. But that TMJ. So first you have to understand like where it's coming from, like, and a doctor can presumably help you with that, like just trying to identify like, why are you having fullness? And depending on the cause of fullness, like there are things, I mean, if it's allergies or sinus issues, or you're sick, like taking a decongestant can help. If it's something like Meniere's, I never really found anything that decreased it a lot in the moment. I used to think that like having a little bit of apple cider vinegar in water would help to like, sometimes helped it to clear and a little bit better, but really it's just a matter of getting your symptoms, trying to like lower your symptoms over time. So there isn't one simple, easy answer there, but it is true that ear fullness can lead to decreased hearing and increased sensitivity for sound, and also increases in tinnitus. So that is a very real problem with a whole wide variety of possible causes and solutions.
That's brilliant. That's a lovely answer. Thank you, Glenn. I've got another question. I've got two more, if that's okay.
Yeah, we got time. Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Glenn. This one is, can tinnitus reduce or go away after stopping drug-induced tinnitus? I imagine that would be a side effect of the drug, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So yes, I mean, I've seen that happen. Tinnitus, sometimes tinnitus goes away as quickly as it came, for not just drug induced, but like, I mean, that's just true. Like if it was caused by some physical problem that gets resolved, sometimes it just goes away. However, not always. I think like in those cases where, so some people do talk about tinnitus where they talk about habituation, rather, where like you can habituate to the point where your tinnitus goes away. And I think this is a bit misleading. Like that never happened to me. No part of me feels like I need that to happen either. My quality of life is every bit as good as before the tinnitus became a problem. And that's sort of the promise of habituation, in my opinion, is you can raise your quality of life back to what it was to pre-tinnitus levels. But I'm sorry, I just lost. Say the question one more time. I just lost my train of thought again.
That's fine. It's fine. Let's go to the last.
No. It's okay. We can finish it. Just say it one more time, just to get me back on track.
Yeah, of course. So the question was, it was about drug-induced side effect tinnitus.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So sometimes it goes away. Sometimes though it doesn't. And I think that depends on how far a person gets into the vicious cycle. Like there is a scenario, like, so take hearing loss, for example. Like with hearing loss, let's say somebody has a clear big hole in their hearing at 4,000 hertz and their tinnitus is a perfect 4,000 hertz sound, right? Like it's probably true that the hearing loss, for whatever reason, is the sole cause of this person's tinnitus. Though it's always difficult. This is an abstract example. Like usually it's very hard to pinpoint a very specific cause of anybody's tinnitus, in my opinion. But let's say this is true. Sometimes you put hearing aids on that person and you amplify that frequency, and it's like you waved a magic wand and it's like 95% better in an instant, and their life is back. But then sometimes you turn on the hearing aids and nothing happens, and they're still in that full-on vicious cycle of fight or flight, anxiety, and reaction. And I think that the most common theories of tinnitus I've seen is that it's like a natural sound in the body that the brain is kind of cranked up the volume on. And so like if your brain latches on and you're reacting in this very intense way, like there is a scenario where you alleviate the underlying cause, but the anxiety pattern is not broken. And then, so maybe in that case, a person who eventually habituates and breaks the anxiety pattern, it does go away. Sometimes it just goes away. But I think that regardless of whether it will eventually go away or not, like holding out hope for that is not a good strategy, because there's a chance you'll be disappointed, maybe a good chance. And regardless of whether it goes away or not, like my argument is that you can work to habituate and get to a quality of life that's every bit as good. And what's interesting to say is like, my tinnitus is not gone. Like I notice it when I walk into a quiet room. I'll notice it at times if I think about it. I mean, I'm talking about tinnitus all day. But my attention just noticing my tinnitus now is like noticing the sound of my air conditioner turn on when I'm trying to watch TV. Like I notice it and then I go back to my show, like nothing happened. And so like I live like, and when you're distracted from your tinnitus, whether you're working or doing something insignificant or something significant and captivating, like you're you're having a lived experience that's exactly the same as somebody who doesn't have tinnitus, right? Like in both cases, you're not thinking about it. It's not in your awareness. You're not really hearing it. It can be heard, but you're not hearing it. And so like my argument is like, maybe it will go away in that case with the drugs, but also it does, even if it doesn't, that's okay too, because you can have a subjective lived experience that's every bit as good and a quality of life that's every bit as good. So that's sort of my answer to that question. And maybe it goes away, but it doesn't need to.
No, great. That's great. Great answer. Okay. The last question is this. My voice seems to irritate my ear, as in it's like touching a nerve when I speak louder than normal. Do you have experience of this, and what can I do about it?
So that's a good question. I do have some experience with this. It's something, or I should say it's something I've seen, like all sorts of strange hearing distortions I've seen. Like it seems like this overactivation of the nervous system, having like bothersome tinnitus, can lead to all sorts of like secondary and closely related problems, right? There's all sorts of there's like an umbrella of like sensory problems like this. Like, and the reality is you can develop a negative reaction to literally anything, any sense perception. And one thing I would like, I've always been like, it seems like unrelated, but I've always been very fidgety. And like, I was thinking about it recently, and it's like, I'll get in bed and I just can't get comfortable. I'm constantly moving, trying to get comfortable. Right. And when I realized it's like, I have I'm very sensitive to touch on the back of my legs. And so like, if I get in bed and the sheet is a little bit wrinkly, you know, and I feel that, or my pants are not like smooth, like it's like, it's hitting at the nervous system. It's activating my awareness so much. It's not so bad that it's causing anxiety or great distress. It's just enough discomfort that I become fidgety until I can get the fidgets out, and then I calm down. So, but what it kind of is interesting to think about is like, you can develop a negative response to any sensory perception, right? You can have like, it could be like a sense of touch. It can be, you know, sometimes be like, I have clients where they'll get like weird head vibrations and buzzing, or body vibrations and buzzing with the tinnitus. And my suspicion is that's like a nervous system activation. So all sorts of strange hearing distortions can happen when it's your own voice. Like ultimately, as far as what to do in that moment, like earplugs are probably not going to help very much. If it's only when you talk loud, like just trying to like, until you get a handle on things, like trying to modulate your volume might help. I think that one thing I wonder about is like, so sometimes by the end of a session when I'm working with people, because like my first session of working with someone is usually up to like 2 hours long. It's like this very comprehensive deep dive. And oftentimes I'll have this thing where if I talk too loud, it feels like my ear is clipping, like a microphone clipping, like a weird distortion happens over a certain volume level. I'm not hearing my voice echoey or anything like that. It's like a distortion of my voice in my ears. Sometimes it'll be other sounds as well. And part of that, I wonder, is not just that I talk loud and I don't realize it, which is true. Like, so it literally might just be I'm aggravating my ear because I'm talking loud for so long without even realizing I'm doing it. But also, like, this comes back to the jaw thing. Like, I don't have TMJ, but I have somatic tinnitus, and I get a lot of pressure and tension in my muscles and my face. I've learned all sorts of relaxation techniques, but talking for 2 hours or an hour, like, that's a lot of working of those muscles, right? And so like trying like facial massage, and like if you look up like TMJ massage, you'll learn like learning to relax those muscles. There's some interesting products, like there's a gentleman, this guy created this interesting product called the Temple Massager that allows you to like work your jaw. I'll give him a free shout out. There's products like templemassager.com if anyone wants to check that out. There's products like that are interesting, but also just it all boils back to like the underlying problem is this overactivation of the nervous system that's caused that's caused the nerves throughout the body to go haywire, right? And so like just working to calm the system, like meditation, relaxation techniques, like all these things we've been talking about, like it helps to improve all of these weird sound distortions and sensory processing issues. Like the strategy seems somewhat universal. I don't have any specific strategies for that problem specifically, where you're hearing your voice very echoey, other than, you know, like taking the broader approach of like, this sounds a lot like other hearing distortions that I see all the time that respond well to calming the nervous system.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic. And I'd just like to say a massive thank you to you, Glenn.
Oh, you're very welcome.
You've been utterly inspiring, not just for our community, but on a personal level. I've found this incredibly rewarding. I'm so
thank you very much. I appreciate the kind words.
So glad we were lucky to have you. Where can people find you, Glenn? So if they were to try and find you on the internet, where do they go? Yeah,
so rewiringtinnitus.com is sort of my home base. Like, you can see all of my articles there, all of my work. You can, if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, you'll see a thing for coaching at the top. You can click that and send an application. If you were interested in the audio that I was talking about, this brainwave entrainment toolkit, you'll see that under the heading of relief audio. And feel free to reach out directly. It's Glenn, Glenn at rewiringtinnitus.com. Always happy to answer questions and engage with people. That's generally the best way to get a hold of me. If anyone's interested in my work with Meniere's, I'm not nearly as active with that. I mean, 95% of the work I'm doing has become tinnitus. It's just where my focus has been. It's where the demand has been, and it's just sort of my career went in that direction. But I still run mindovermenieres.com. That's my first book, is also Mind Over Meniere's. My books are available on Amazon worldwide. I periodically make Rewiring Tinnitus free. I do that at least a couple times a year, but I mean, it's inexpensive, the ebook. If anyone can't afford it, just email me. I'll send you a free copy. But yeah, my rewiringtinnitus.com, you can find all of my work there. That's a good central spot.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And what I'd like to do is to get back with you in a couple of weeks and have a little debrief,
Sure.
Work out how we can maybe collaborate. But
Sounds
I
good.
wholeheartedly thank you. And lastly, I would love to take this opportunity to wholeheartedly welcome anyone that is curious enough to join our community, our T-minus community. And I would like to leave this evening with a quote, and it's a very serendipitous kind of moment, Glenn. I find these quotes, I'm not obsessed on these types of things, but I found something that popped into the ether and I wrote it down, and it absolutely resonates.
All right. I love a good quote.
By Alan Turing, and it's you. And it's this, and it's very simple. Sometimes it is the people no one can imagine anything of who do the things no one can imagine. And that sums you up.
I like
beautifully,
that.
Glenn.
Well, thank you. That's high praise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you can see us
You're very
on
welcome.
Social media channels, and just find us where you want to look up T-minus. But thanks again, Glenn. Wonderful.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.